Good afternoon, this is vk3sl, testing on 160 metres in the narrowband FM mode. Afternoon missions. We do this each day between 5 and 6. It's a bit of a Corona special to provide another dimension to afternoon containment living. And of course it's nothing to do with entertainment. But if you do feel inclined to be entertained, there are new platforms on offer at the moment. We do have our usual streaming service, our Broadwave streaming service, which we've been using for some time. That can be accessed via my QRZ page. It's easy to find. You just look up my call sign. But another option is being tested today as we speak, and that is a new YouTube channel. And the name of the channel is vk3sl, all in lowercase. It's only just been created and it's recently been authenticated, so it's up and running, and I'm testing a live stream as we speak using the Streamlabs OBS software to interface YT with the booth here. And it seems to be okay. I was just checking on the phone, and so if you feel inclined, have a listen. It's an alternative, and it may be the premier platform after a while. We'll run both streams in tandem for some time, see how we go. And in addition to that, there is a station email address now, and that's my call sign again, vk3sl, all lowercase, at hotmail.com. So if you feel inclined to send a message or a complaint or vent something about any aspect of this transmission, please feel free. I'm there to be abused. And speaking of such, last night's missions, we played a recording of Tommy Dorsey and his orchestra. In fact, it was the Dorsey Brothers Orchestra, a recording made in 1934, and it had some of the most outrageous lyrics. Now, Frank brought that to my attention last night. I wasn't really listening at the time. I was carried away with the minor key and the dark inflection of the song. But have a listen to these lyrics. It's all about domestic violence. It's pretty full on, and it's an interesting statement of the time. So I think we'll kickstart with that today, and then we'll see what happens thereafter. This is vk3sl testing.
He's never dressed in splendor. A patcher, he's rough and then so tender. And though I'm just a whim, I still belong to him. He's my patcher. A patcher, he crushes when he holds me. A patcher, he thrills me when he scolds me. There's fire in his eyes, but I'm in paradise with my patcher. To haunting strains of violin, we dance again together. I'm black and blue before we're through, but still we dance together. Apache, he treats me like a stranger. Apache, his very name spells danger. And though he throws me down and tosses me around, he's my Apache.
Dorsey Brothers Orchestra from 1934. Apache. Now, of course, they might have been just referring to the play acting that goes with the tango. There's a lot of sort of play in the gestures, so maybe I'd like to think it's more about that. But thanks, Frank, for bringing that to my attention. Yeah, all right. We are testing here on 160 metres, and there is a concurrent stream, both with the Broadwave streaming service, which we usually use, and also a YouTube streaming service, which is brand new. This is the first test of that system, and it can be found by looking up my call sign. Now, it may not be high on the triage of searches. You might have to dig deep to find it, but it is the name of the channel, vk3sl, all in lowercase. So maybe it can be found, hopefully. Yeah, probably an act of grand delusion doing this, but it's another system, another approach, and it's all in the spirit of testing, and that's what we do here. These are test missions. There's nothing else intended. Certainly nothing about entertainment whatsoever. Okay. Today I'd like to present one of Lenny Bernstein's lectures. So I've found one, and I've cleaned it up a little bit and regurgitated. That's what we do here. We regurgitate. We don't inform. I'll let him do the informing. And it's good. It's about melody. It's a lecture on melody. And he has the New York Philharmonic Orchestra at his disposal. So it's pretty impressive. So let's have a listen. Mr. Bernstein. This is vk3sl testing.
From Philharmonic Hall in Lincoln Center, home of the world's greatest musical events, another program in the award-winning series, the New York Philharmonic Young People's Concerts, under the musical direction of Leonard Bernstein.
And here is Mr. Bernstein.
My dear young friends, on our last program, we devoted so much time to introducing our new Philharmonic Hall to you and to introducing you to the new science of acoustics that we didn't get to talk very much about music. So today, we're going to make up for lost time and talk about the meat and potatoes of music, the main course, which is melody. Now, to some people, music and melody are the same thing. It's the whole meal, so to speak. When you think of music, you think of melody right away. And they're right in a way, because what is music anyway, except sounds that change and move along in time? And that's practically a definition of melody too. A series of notes that move along in time, one after another. Well, if that's true, then it's almost impossible to write music that doesn't have melody in it. I mean, if a melody is simply one note coming after another, how can a composer avoid writing melodies if he just writes notes? He must write melodies all the time. For example, he writes one note, then he writes another. Well, that's already a sort of melody. It's a two-note melody, sort of. Then we add another note. Well, it's already a little more melodious, isn't it? But if he then adds a few more, well, we've got many Mendelssohn's Wedding March. See how simple it is? Where there's music, there's melody. Can't have one without the other. Well, then why do so many people complain about music that has no melody? Some people say they don't like Bach fugues because they don't find them melodic. And others say the same thing about Wagner operas, and others about modern music, and others about jazz. What do you suppose they mean when they say it's not melodic? What are they talking about? Isn't any string of notes a melody? Well, I think the answer is in the fact that melody can be a lot of different things. It can be a tune, or it can be a theme, or a motive, or a long melodic line, or a bass line, or an inner voice, all those things. And the minute we understand the difference among all those kinds of melody, then I think we'll be able to understand the whole problem. You see, people usually think of melody as a tune, something you can go out whistling, that's easy to remember, that sticks in your mind. What's more, a tune almost never goes out of the range of the normal human singing voice, that is, too high or too low. Nor should a tune have phrases that last longer than the normal breath can sing them. After all, melody is the singing side of music, just as rhythm is the dancing side. But the most important thing about a tune is usually that it's complete in itself. It seems to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it leaves you feeling satisfied. In other words, it's a song, like Gershwin's Summertime, or Schubert's Serenade, or your favorite Elvis Presley number. But in symphonic music, which is what we're mostly concerned with here, tunes aren't exactly in order, because since they're complete in themselves, tunes don't cry out for further development. And as I hope you remember from former programs of ours, development is the main thing in symphonic music, the growing of a melodic seed into a big symphonic tree. So that seed mustn't be a complete tune, but rather a melody that leaves something still to be said, to be developed. And that kind of melody is called a theme. Well, that's already a problem for those people who are always expecting music to consist of full-blown tunes. So they naturally find these incomplete themes less melodic, let's say. I suppose then they should complain about the famous four-note theme that opens Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. That's hardly melodic at all. Or about this theme from his Seventh Symphony, which is mostly harping on the same note. But both of those themes are kind of melodies, even though they're not tunes. That's the important thing to remember. They're not tunes, but they're themes. Now, of course, there are symphonic themes that are much more melodious than those. Only think of Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony, for example. Now that theme is practically a whole tune in itself. What is it about that big tuneful theme that makes it so attractive and beloved all over the world, besides the fact that Tchaikovsky was a melodic genius? Well, the answer is repetition, either exact repetition or a slightly altered repetition within the theme itself. And it's that repetition that makes the melody stick in your mind. And it's the melodies that stick in your mind that are likely to please you the most. Popular songwriters know this, and that's why they repeat their phrases so often. Just think of that big song hit, Mac the Knife. Ba 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 ba, repeating over and over. Well, the same technique works just as well in symphonic music. For instance, let's just see how Tchaikovsky went about building up that lovely theme we just heard by simply repeating his ideas in a certain arranged order, what I like to call the 1-2-3 method. In fact, so many famous themes are formed by exactly this method that I think you ought to know about it. Here's how it works. First of all, there's a short idea or a phrase. That's number one. Now, second, the same phrase is repeated, but with a small variation. That's the second part, almost the same as the first. And the third, the tune takes off in a flight of inspiration. And so on. That's the 1, 2, 3 method. It's like a 3-stage rocket, or like the countdown in a race. On your mark, get set, go. Or in target practice, ready, aim, fire. Or in a movie studio, lights, camera, action. It's always the same, 1, 2, and then 3. And there are so many examples of this melodic technique, I almost don't know where to begin. But let's take, for one example, our good old standby, Beethoven's Fifth. Here, 1, on your mark. 2, get set. 3, go. One, 2, 3. Or do you know that haunting theme in the César Franck Symphony? It's the same thing. First, there's a phrase. Then he repeats the phrase with a slight change, a rising intensity. And then comes the relaxed conclusion. Or the same thing is true in Mozart's Hafner Symphony. It goes, ready, aim, fire, and so on. There are millions of them, examples of this 1, 2, 3 design. And don't forget that the heart of the matter is repetition. 2 is always a repeat of 1, and 3 is the takeoff. Well, now that we know a couple of the secrets that make music sound melodic, let's start looking for some of the reasons why people find certain kinds of music unmelodic. We've already discovered that what appeals most to people as melody is a fully spun out tune, right? And that when they get instead an incomplete tune or a theme, they begin to have trouble. So you can imagine that when they hear music made out of melodies that are even shorter than themes, they have even more trouble. For example, that famous opening of Beethoven's Fifth again. Ba-ba-ba-ba. Now, that's so short, it's not really even a theme, but what is called a motive. Now, a motive can be as little as 2 notes, or 3 or 4, a bare melodic seed, the raw material out of which much longer melodic lines are made. Now, you remember I said that certain people find Wagner's operas unmelodic? Well, this is why, because Wagner usually constructed those huge operas of his out of tiny little motives, instead of writing regular tunes, such as the Italian opera composers used. But how wrong they are to say Wagner doesn't write melody. He writes nothing but melody, only it's melody that's made out of motives. Now, let me show you how. You've all heard of Wagner's great opera Tristan and Isolde, and I'm sure you've heard the prelude. Now, this prelude begins with a 4-note motive, like this. And immediately after comes another motive, also of 4 notes. Now, the exciting thing is the way Wagner puts these 2 motives together. He makes the second motive begin smack on the end of the first one, so that the last note of one and the first note of the other are joined, locked together, locking the 2 motives securely, like this. Now he adds some marvelous harmony underneath, and this is what you get, the beginning of Tristan and Isolde. Now that's already much more than a motive, or even of 2 motives. It's become what's called a phrase, just as a series of words in language becomes a phrase. And Wagner, by using this method of joining motives together and making phrases out of them, and then sentences out of the phrases, and then paragraphs out of the sentences, finally turns out a whole story, a prelude to Tristan, that is a miracle of continuous melody without end, seemingly, even though there isn't a tune anywhere in it. Do you begin to see what I mean by understanding melody in a different way? If you think you don't, just listen to a couple of minutes of this famous prelude now, and I'm sure you'll be surprised to find that you do understand it very well. And on it goes, one long, passionate melody for almost 10 minutes. And that sure is a lot of melody for a composer who's supposed to be unmelodic. But you see, his melody grew out of little scraps, those motives we heard at the beginning. And that's where people make the mistake of thinking there's no melody in Wagner. Of course, what makes it even more difficult for people to recognize the melody is that frightening word counterpoint, which means, as you know, more than one melody going on at the same time. That really gets in people's way, but it shouldn't, because after all, the more melody, the better. And counterpoint can be terribly exciting. For example, in this same Tristan prelude, much later on, Wagner builds a hair-raising climax by using counterpoint in this way. The strings are pouring out their melody, climbing higher and higher, like this. while that frenzy is going on, the horns and cellos down lower are screaming out the first four-note motive we heard, over and over, like this. And that's not all. At the same time, the trumpet joins in with all his force, right in the middle, between the other two melodies, singing the second four-note motive, again and again, like this. Now, do you think all that's too much melody for a human ear to catch all at once? Well, just listen to it all together, and I'll bet you hear it all, every note. Boy, what a climax that is. One of the most thrilling ever composed. And yet it's counterpoint, that frightening word that makes some people afraid to listen to Bach fugues or to Wagner operas. But don't you ever be scared of counterpoint. Counterpoint is not an absence of melody, it's an abundance of melody. It doesn't erase melody, it multiplies it. Well, now that's a lot of hard stuff we've been discussing so far, and so to make it clearer and easier for you, we're going to play you a whole movement from a Mozart symphony, the first movement of his great G minor symphony, which will illustrate everything we've been talking about so far. I'm sure you all know the beautiful theme that opens this movement. It's a perfect example of that 1-2-3 method we learned about before. First, there's a phrase. And then he repeats the same phrase slightly lower. And then third, the takeoff. Now, certainly nobody will quarrel with that as being unmelodic. It has such a beautiful shape and arch, the way it goes up and down. And that's another important feature of good melody, its shape, the curve it makes as it rises with tension and then sinks down in relaxation. And this Mozart theme is a perfectly shaped melody. I'm sure you'll all agree with that. But in the course of the movement, as the theme is being developed, you'll find all kinds of places that might be called unmelodic, or at least less melodic. But you're ready now to understand that even those places are melodic as much as the opening theme is, if you just listen to them correctly. For instance, you'll notice that the very first two notes of the main theme, those two notes form a little motive by themselves, just as in Wagner. Remember that motive?
This is a test transmission from vk3sl.
Because it's used all through the movement. Now, about halfway along in this movement, one part of the orchestra is playing with this motive this way. While the strings are playing in counterpoint, the same two-note motive, only stretched out in long notes. You see? So that together, it all makes this wonderful sound. And that's all made out of those first two little notes that I played for you before. So you see, it's all pure melody, even the development parts. And the same is true of this seemingly unmelodic section. Now, some people would say that passage lacks melody, but the theme is right there, only it's down in the bass instruments here. While on top here, there's exciting counterpoint going on, the way it goes in a Bach fugue. You see, you just have to learn to listen for melody in the depths of music as well as on top. Tunes aren't always on top. And if you do listen that way, how different that same passage will sound to you. Just try and listen again. You see? And what's even harder to hear is melody that's neither on top nor on the bottom, but in the middle, sort of like the middle of a sandwich. Now here's one place in the movement you should be on the lookout for, where again that little two-note motive is being developed on top over motionless notes on the bottom, like this. Now in the middle, there are two clarinets having their say about the motive, like this. And they're so sweet and tender that it would be a shame if you missed them. It would be like having two pieces of dry bread with nothing in them. So now listen to the whole sandwich, top slice, bottom slice, and clarinet filling. So all that is melody, too, made out of those first two little notes of the theme. Well, I think you're ready now to hear this great movement by Mozart and listen to it as melody, all of it from start to finish. Not just the themes themselves, but the development of those themes and the motives as well, with all their counterpoint. It's all melody every moment. Now, the title of this program is, What is a Melody? Well, what is it? Have we found out yet? Any series of notes, we said before, but that's not a very satisfying answer because some series of notes please us and others don't. So I guess the question ought to be, what makes an unmelody? Well, so far, we've discussed a few of the reasons why some people find certain kinds of music unmelodic, like melodies going against each other as in counterpoint, or a melody singing away down in the bass, not easily recognized, or buried in the middle of a sandwich, which is hard to find, or a melody constructed out of tiny motives, which is not exactly a tune. But the really important reason, and I think this is what I've been trying to get at all this time, is the question of what our ears expect. In other words, what we call taste. And that, in turn, depends on what our ears are used to hearing. For instance, we've seen today how important repetition is in making a melody easy to latch onto. Okay, but what happens when we hear melodies that don't repeat at all, that just weave on and on, always new? Well, it's true that we usually like them less at first, but that doesn't mean they're any less melodic. In fact, the farther away you get from that kind of repetition, like Mac the Knife, the harder the melodies may get to latch onto, but also the more beautiful and nobler they can become. Some of the really greatest melodies ever written are of this kind, non-repeating long lines, only they're not necessarily the ones people go around whistling in the streets. I remember, for instance, so well the day my piano teacher brought me a new piece to study when I was 14 years old or so, which was Bach's Italian Concerto. And when I began to read the second movement with its long ornamental melody line, I simply couldn't understand it. It just seemed to wander around with no place to go. Do you know it? It goes like this.
This is a test transmission from vk3sl.
And so it goes on weaving, spinning out that long golden thread, never once repeating itself for almost 5 minutes. Do you find it wandering and aimless? I find it one of the glories of all music now, today, but I sure didn't think so when I was 14. I was still young enough to think that every melody had to be a repeating tune, because that's what my brief musical experience had taught my ears to expect. Now, in exactly the same way our tastes change with growing up and hearing all kinds of different music, so people's tastes change from one period of history to another. The melodies people loved in Beethoven's time would have shocked and startled the people of Bach's time 100 years earlier. And I'm equally sure that some of today's modern music, which people complain about as ugly and unmelodic, will be perfectly charming, everyday stuff to the people of tomorrow. We're going to play you an example, another long, non-repeating melodic line by the great modern German composer, Paul Hindemith. Now, Hindemith wrote this melody over 30 years ago in a piece called Concert Music for Strings and Brass. And I suppose there are still people who call this unmelodic even after 30 years. I consider it one of the most moving and beautifully shaped melodies, not only of modern music, but of all music. And I have a feeling that you'll agree with me after all you've learned about melody today. Just listen. Well, whether you like that or not, that is a great melodic line. 4 minutes of beautiful curves, arches, peaks, and valleys, and full of emotional beauty. And if there are any of you who didn't like it, who found it unmelodic, awkward, or graceless, let me comfort you by saying that those were just the exact words used 80 years ago about another German composer named Brahms. Now, these days, when we think of melody, we almost immediately think of the name Brahms. But there was a time when people complained bitterly about his music as being totally lacking in melody. And so to wind up our program on melody, we're going to play Brahms. And to show you how careful you have to be in deciding what is a melody and what isn't, we're going to play for you the last movement of Brahms' Fourth Symphony, an extraordinary movement for many reasons, but chiefly for the reason that its main theme is nothing but a scale of 6 notes plus 2 notes to finish it off. I played 5 notes. Now, wait a minute. 6 notes. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then 2 notes to finish it off, which makes 8 notes. 8 notes in all, 1 to a bar. And with harmony, they sound like this. Now, following those 8 bars come 30 variations, each one also 8 bars long, and each one containing those same 8 simple notes, always in the same key. And that, plus a short wind-up at the end, is the whole movement. Now, that doesn't sound very promising in terms of melody, does it? A scale and a cadence. And yet, what Brahms gives us in this movement is a work of such glowing, fiery, melodic beauty that we are left at the end cheering. Now, how does he do it? In all the ways we talked about today: counterpoint, motives, repetitions, the theme in the bass, the theme in the middle, the 1-2-3 method, remember? But I'm not going to explain it any further to you because I think that by this time you're prepared to hear this so-called unmelodic work of Brahms as the magnificent outpouring of melody that it really is. And if you're still wondering what is melody, just listen to this movement and you'll realize that melody is exactly what a great composer wants it to be.
transmission from vk3sl.
From Philharmonic Hall in Lincoln Center, another New York Philharmonic Young People's Concert under the musical direction of Leonard Bernstein. This concert, What is a Melody, featured the music of Wagner, Mozart, Hindemith, and Brahms. The preceding program was pre-recorded and was produced and directed by Roger Englander.
This is vk3sl. You've been listening to one of the inimitable Bernstein lectures on music appreciation. They're fantastic. And we need to have a channel just for these. There's such great material, and he has such a natural way of relating this music, making it accessible. Wow, hearing the Brahms, it's music for eternity, isn't it? Oh, golly, leaves the hair on the back of your neck standing. It's amazing stuff. Yes. All right, well, we'll continue just for a little longer, but we'll hear something completely different, I think. And we'll have a listen now to some Teddy Wilson off an old 10-inch LP. This is vk3sl. We're testing the narrowband FM mode. And just a word to invite people to listen to further missions this evening. Mr. Long is doing his missions on Channel D. That's 147.475 megahertz. It'll always be a wonderful feast of information. It'll be great. So tune into that. And we'll catch up next time. vk3sl.
This is a test transmission from vk3sl.
Cool Jazz from Teddy Wilson, and his ensemble recorded in the 50s on a Mercury disc, on a 10-inch record. Okay, I think that'll be it for this evening. We will be back, hopefully. And thank you for listening in if you've done so. And also just letting you know that there are new formats. We've got the YouTube format. Look up my call sign on YouTube. Just my call sign in lower case. That's vk3sl. And you'll find that there is a YouTube channel dedicated to mission replays and live streaming. So that's the new order. So definitely have a look at that. You'll find that this test from this afternoon's transmission will be up and ready for those who want to re-engage, and I'll be listening just to see what it came through and just get some idea of how to work with the system. It's a little different, and I hopefully it'll become quite straightforward as we gain some momentum. And also I should mention that there is an email address associated with these missions now. Again, my call sign at hotmail.com. And I've now put that on the phone, so there is immediate access. So if anyone wants to try making contact, you're more than welcome. And any feedback's well received. Maybe you've got a complaint. Maybe you feel like it interferes with your grey line ambitions, which I'm completely open to. I will gladly move aside if need be. So there's nothing too demonstrative or obstinate about these test transmissions. So I think we'll leave it at that for today, and we'll speak again next time. vk3sl testing.